Today we're going to look at the Renaissance in Europe. In art history, the High Renaissance was considered to be a short period of the most exceptional artistic production in the Italian states, particularly in Rome, and the capital of the Papal States, and in Florence during the Italian Renaissance. Most art historians state that the High Renaissance started between 1490 and 1500 and ended in 1520 with the death of Raphael, although some say the High Renaissance ended around 1525 to 1527 with the sack of Rome by the mutinous army of Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire. The best known exponents of painting, sculpture, and architecture of the High Renaissance include Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Bramante, but many experts believe that the Renaissance pushed further out into the northern part of Europe and into England. And so today we're not going to just look at the Renaissance as being something that happened in Italy, but happened also in other parts of Europe. When we think of the term Renaissance, we have to know that that term literally means rebirth. So in the 21st century, the use of that term has been criticized frequently by academics, art historians, and others for oversimplifying the artistic developments and ignoring the historical context in which these developments were created and focusing on only a few iconic artists. So the rebirth, or the Renaissance, was a period that followed the Middle Ages, and it was brought throughout Europe. It was a time of renewed interest in things of the world. It was about human beings and their actual conditions. So that's where we start to see images like good government. B, it was about education, art, literature, and science. And C, the time frame is not exact, but we approximated at around 1300 to about 1600. And I think this image that Michelangelo painted on the Sistine Chapel is a perfect example of where we should think about, how the Renaissance, what the core principles of it were, because here we have, the idea of God and Adam, and this finger, the touching of giving you, this ability of life. And it's pretty incredible stuff. So the Renaissance started in Italy, where wealth from trade supported art and learning. Here also, modern capitalism was born. Private individuals, or companies, if you will, for the first time owned businesses. Businesses were not owned only by the government, by the monarchy, or by the feudal system. The owners of businesses became private individuals. So that was a big deal. And their main profit was, to make money. That was the goal, to make money. So Republican government arose in most cities, and the citizens participated. Niccolo Machiavelli was a prince in 1513, said basically, one must do whatever one must do to get and stay in power. If it works, it is the right thing to do. Forget ideals, lie, cheat, even murder if you must. A stable state is needed, and the only way to get that would be money. So humanism was a system of thought and action that was concerned more with human interests and values, and it was the dominant movement of the Renaissance. Human beings should have dignity and intelligence. They, or we, can change the world and make it a better place for everyone. So that was a big part of why this movement took hold. The idea of the rebirth, or the Renaissance man, was successful in business. He was well-mannered, he educated, athletic, and brave. The goal of education became making people well-rounded. And this is where we get the idea of modern liberal education, the idea that people need to know a little bit about everything in order to be able to understand it and make decisions around it. Religion remained important, but the authority and some of the practices of the church began to be questioned. The Gutenberg Bible was a huge step in terms of how the Renaissance moved forward. The Gutenberg Bible, named for the craftsman and inventor of printing by use of movable type, Johannes Gutenberg, was completed in 1455 at Mainz, Germany. The 3-volume Latin text arguably represents the greatest single innovation in the history of communication technology, as well as a style of printing that existed almost unaltered until the 20th century. Gutenberg's invention and the dispersion of relatively cheap printed materials, cheap books, ultimately stimulated enormous changes in our culture. It stimulated changes in social, political, economic, and religious thought. Some 40 perfect vellum copies of Gutenberg's masterpiece of technology and advancement still exist in the world today. And so it's very much like the idea of democratization of thought, because before that, the only way that you could have a book was if some scribe had made it and then it was purchased by the king or the queen or the prince, and it was in the church and, or a very, expensive library, and it was not something that could be simply purchased by common people. And so once the ability for people to own businesses happened, then we start to see the changes in how people were able to understand and get more information, because they could buy books now and they could read them, and the whole world became more literate. So brilliant people lived during this time. If there's one thing we can say about the people during the Renaissance, brilliant people lived during this time. So let's start with Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was an Italian polymath of the Renaissance, whose areas of interest included science and invention, drawing, painting, sculpture, architecture, music, mathematics, engineering, literature, anatomy, geology, astronomy, botany, paleontology, and cartography. I mean, how big is that list? Does everybody else in this room have that many interests? Wow. He has been variously called the father of paleontology, iconology, and architecture, and is widely considered one of the greatest painters of all time, despite perhaps finishing only about 15 paintings. At least those are the ones that survived. He was born out of wedlock to a notary, Piero da Vinci, and a peasant woman named Caterina in Vinci, a region in Florence, Italy. Leonardo was well educated in the studio of a renowned Italian painter by the name of Andrea del Verrocchio. Much of his earlier work was spent in the service of Ludovico Moro in Milan, and he later worked in Rome, Bologna, and Venice. He spent his last 3 years in France, where he died in 1519. He painted the Mona Lisa, studied geology, chemistry, and anatomy, designed buildings, designed canals and weapons, and sketched engines and even flying machines. The next artist that we're going to talk about is Michelangelo Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni. He was born in 1475 and he died in 1564. He was an Italian sculptor, painter, architect, and poet of the High Renaissance, born also in Florence, who exerted an unparalleled influence on the development of Western art. His artistic versatility was of such a high order that he is often considered a contender for the title of archetypal Renaissance man. Along with his rival, the fellow Florentine Leonardo da Vinci, several scholars have described Michelangelo as one of the greatest artists of his age, and even one of the greatest artists of all time. A number of Michelangelo's works of painting, sculpture, and architecture rank among the most famous in existence. His output in these fields was prodigious. Given the sheer volume of surviving correspondence, sketches, and remnants, he is the best well-documented artist in the 16th century. He sculpted two of his best-known works, the Pietà and the David, before the age of 30. I think he was only 23 years old when he did the Pietà. Despite holding a low opinion of painting, he also created two of the most influential frescoes in the history of Western art: the scenes from the Genesis on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, and the Last Judgment on the Sistine Chapel altar wall. His design of the Laurentian Library pioneered Mannerist architecture. At the age of 74, he succeeded Antonio di Sangallo the Younger as the architect of St. Peter's Basilica. He transformed the plan so that the western end was finished to his design, as was the dome, with some modifications after his death. In 1505, Michelangelo was invited to Rome by the newly elected Pope Julius II. He was commissioned to build the Pope's tomb, which was to include 40 statues and be finished in 5 years. Under the patronage of the Pope, Michelangelo experienced constant interruptions to his work on the tomb in order to accomplish other tasks. And this really frustrated Michelangelo. And although he worked on the tomb for almost 40 years, it was never finished to his satisfaction. It is located in the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome, and is the most famous for his central figure of Moses, completed in, we're thinking around 1520, but we're not sure. There's not a real verification of the time that it was completed. Of the other statues intended for the tomb, 2 known as the heroic captive, rebellious slave, and the dying slave are now in the Louvre. During the same time, Michelangelo painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which took approximately 4 years to complete, 1508 to 1512. 134 paintings, according to Contivi's account. Bramante, who was working on the building at St. Peter's Basilica, resented Michelangelo's commission for the Pope's tomb and convinced the Pope to commission him in a medium with which he was unfamiliar and, as we know, didn't really like, because he was hoping that maybe Michelangelo would fail. Michelangelo was originally commissioned to paint the 12 apostles in a triangular pendentive that supported the ceiling and cover the central part of the ceiling with ornaments. Well, Michelangelo then persuaded Pope Julius to give him free rein, and he proposed a different and more complex scheme, representing the creation and the fall of man, the promise of salvation through the prophets, and the genealogy of Christ. The work is part of a larger scheme of decoration within the chapel, which represents much of the doctrine of the Catholic Church. The composition stretches over 45 feet and 100 by 128 feet of the ceiling, and at the end of the day, it contained over 300 figures. At its center are 9 episodes from the book of Genesis, divided into 3 groups: God's creation of the world, God's creation of humankind, and their fall from God's grace, and lastly, the state of humanity and sin as represented by Noah and his family. On the pendentives supporting the ceiling are painted 12 men and women who prophesied the coming of Christ: 7 prophets of Israel: Joel, Ezekiel, Jonah, Daniel, Jeremiah, Zechariah, and Isaiah, and 5 sibyls: Eritrean, Delphic, Libyan, Cumaean, and Persian. These prophetic women of the classical world also prophesied that Christ would come. Among the most famous paintings on the ceiling are the creation of Adam, which we're looking at here, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and the Deluge, the prophet Jeremiah, and the Curian Sibyl. Desiderius Erasmus was a Dutch philosopher and Christian scholar who widely considered to have been one of the greatest scholars of the Renaissance. And as a Catholic priest, Erasmus was an important figure in classical scholarship, who wrote in a purely Latin style. Among the humanists, he enjoyed the sobriquet of the Prince of the Humanists, and has been called the crowning glory of the Christian humanists. Using humanist techniques for working on texts, he prepared important new Latin and Greek editions of the New Testament, which raised questions that would be influential in the Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. He also wrote on free will. Erasmus lived against the backdrop of the growing religious Reformation and questioning that was happening during this time of the Renaissance. He looked at the abuses in the Catholic Church and called for reform. He nonetheless kept his distance from Luther, Henry VIII, and John Calvin, and continued to recognize the authority of the Pope, emphasizing a middle way, with a deep respect for traditional faith, piety, and grace, and rejecting Luther's emphasis on faith alone. Erasmus remained a member of the Catholic Church all his life, remained committed to reforming the Church and its clerics' abuses from within. He also held to the doctrine of synergism, which some reformers, the Calvinists in particular, rejected in favor of the doctrine of Mongerism. His middle road via media term approach disappointed and even angered scholars in both camps. But it's important to realize that all of this stuff is happening at the same time. Another artist who was extremely important during this time was Raphael Sanzio. Raphael Sanzio was an Italian painter and architect of the High Renaissance. His work is admired for its clarity of form, ease of composition, and visual achievement of the Neoplatonic ideal of human grandeur. Together with Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, he forms the traditional trinity of great masters of that period. Raphael was enormously productive, running an unusually large workshop, and despite his early death at the young age of 37, left a large body of work. Many of his works are found in the Vatican Palace, where the fresco Raphael rooms were the central and the largest work of his career. The best-known work is the School of Athens in the Vatican Stanza della Segnatura. After his early years in Rome, much of his work was executed by the workshops from his drawings, with considerable loss of quality. He was extremely influential in his lifetime. Though outside of Rome, his work was mostly known from his collaborative printmaking. After his death, the influence of his great rival Michelangelo was more widespread until the 18th and 19th century, when Raphael's more serene and harmonious qualities were again regarded as some of the highest models. His career falls naturally into three phases and three styles, first described by Giorgio Vasari in his book. His early years in Umbria, then a period of about 4 years, 1504 to 1508, absorbing the artistic traditions of Florence, followed by his last hectic and triumphant 12 years in Rome, working for two popes and their close associates. Another artist that comes more towards the end of the Renaissance period would be Titian, Tiziano Vezzelli. Titian was an Italian painter during the Renaissance. Considered the most important member of the 16th century Venetian school from Venice, he was born in Pieve Cadore near Bologna, the Republic of Venice. During his lifetime, he was often called da Cadore, from Cadore, taken from his native region. Recognized by his contemporaries as the sun amidst small stars, Titian was one of the most versatile Italian painters, equally adept with portraits, landscapes, backgrounds, and the mythological and religious subjects. His painting methods, particularly the application and use of color, are excised as the most profound influence not only on the painters of the late Renaissance, but in all future generations of painters of Western art. His career was successful from the start, and he was sought after by many different patrons, initially in Venice, and then the northern Italian princes, and finally the Habsburgs in Germany and the papacy. Along with Giorgione, he is considered the young founder of the Venetian school of Italian Renaissance painting. During the course of his long life, Titian's artistic manner changed drastically, but he retained a lifelong interest in color. Although his mature works may not contain the vivid, luminous tints of his earlier pieces, their loose brushwork and subtlety of tone were without precedent in early history of Western painting. So next, we're going to look at the Northern Renaissance, but that is kind of pulls us together. So a very brief overview of the High Renaissance in Italy.